Gary Bobroff, welcome back to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Glad to be here, David.
Well, I say welcome back because you were on the show in 2014 and then again in 2015, and episode number 448, Understanding Our Archetypal Nature. And the other one was 417, A Jungian Understanding of Crop Circles. So,
Yeah,
well, first of all, I want to be discussing your latest book, Knowledge in a Nutshell, Carl Jung. And the first part of that title makes it sound like it's in a knowledge in a nutshell series or something. Is there something like that
that's
going on?
correct. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. What's the story there?
Well, it's from Arcturus Books in London, and they have
Okay.
a series of knowledge in a nutshell. So someone else has just done Sigmund Freud, and they've done philosophy and different schools of thought like that.
Okay. Okay. And given that there are so many introductory books out there about Jung, what led you to add yet another?
Well, I mean, there are some. I mean, I think it's sort of an ongoing thing that the Jungian world is looking for a good intro book on Jung. Even Man and His Symbols or Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung's autobiography are not. I mean, they're great books, but they're not really introductory. So there's an ongoing question in the Jungian world around what's a good book to read to start Jung, and there's been a few that have come out in the last few years. So there's a few new ones. I haven't seen all of them, but
Uh-huh.
there's a few new ones, and this is one of them.
Well, there was one I used for years in a class that I taught called Myths, Dream, and Symbol. And it was Boundaries of the Soul by June Singer. But by
Yeah.
now that's quite old. And so,
Well, I've taught that book a few times.
oh,
So
really? Yeah.
yeah, I've taught that book as an intro to Jung reading group, and done that a few times. And you'll see, some quotes from June in there. And absolutely, it's a great book. Again, the Knowledge in a Nutshell book is 40,000 words, so it's very introductory, a small book, and certainly smaller than June's book. I would certainly recommend June's book as the book after
Yeah,
Knowledge in a
right.
Nutshell.
Yeah. If I were teaching that book still, if I were teaching that class still, I would use your book. I do think I would. I think you've done an incredible job. Um, I wanted to ask you uh, what what you think might make your book stand out. What's the secret sauce, if I may ask?
Well, I think partly it's um, short sentences.
Yes.
It's readable, it's quick, it moves.
Yeah.
I think there's an academic way of writing that some of the Jungian world wants to do and is interested in, and that's great. But um, I sort of did that in my first book, and I like to write things in a concise fashion. Um,
Yeah. Good. Good.
so
Because I find I'm reading in a more and more concise fashion, and and I have my own impression about what the secret sauce is here.
okay,
You kind of put your finger on it. For me, I find it to be very well written, very readable, and really makes Jung accessible to today's reader. June Singer, that earlier book that I mentioned to, it was great for readers who came either in the late 60s or early 70s. So she used lots of examples that were relevant to people in that particular period. But, among young people today, I'm not sure that they would connect. And then the other thing that you kind of allude to is that much of Jung's own writing and those of the writings of his followers can be very daunting and fairly impenetrable to the novice. So I think your book does a real service to people who are just trying to get into it.
thank you.
And actually, the Singer book was really my introduction to Jung by and large. Everybody was talking about Carl Jung and how important he was and so on. Well, in my doctoral program, I think there were maybe 2 pages in the big fat personality text devoted to Jung. It was kind of
Mhm.
dismissed.
Hmm.
And so that book really opened it up for me. I think your book will open it up for other people,
Thank you.
for today's crop of young people.
Thank you.
At what point in your life did you discover Jung?
Well, writing this book, I kind of had to think about that. I was really, really lucky. So I grew up in Saskatchewan, Canada, which had a really, literally award-winning education system. When I was in the public school
Mm.
education system in Saskatchewan and Saskatoon, our school district that I was in literally won like a North America wide,
Wow,
best.
lucky
Uh,
you.
yeah. So, and we also, there's a university in the town, so there was a lot of exceptionally bright teachers teaching grade school. And I also was lucky to get, they had an advanced program at that time, and so I was in grade 7 and 8. I was in an advanced group, and one of the things that we got to do in grade 7 was the
Wow.
Myers Briggs.
Aha. Okay. The Myers-Briggs
So
personality inventory. Yeah.
yeah, so I was doing the MBTI when I was 13.
Yeah.
So then actually the teacher I had at that point later taught, about 10 years later, taught a workshop on Tony Wolff's archetypes, which was my first real introduction to the depth of Jung. And so at 23, from the same person actually, Rita Priestley, I received both my introduction to MBTI and my introduction to Tony Wolff's archetypes. And getting introduced to Tony Wolff's archetypes just blew my mind. I was really got that there were these patterns underneath our lives, and it really made a lot of sense to me. And you'll see that Tony Wolff's work is in the book as well. And,
Yes. Yes. I
um,
did see that.
so, so yeah, that was my first introduction, and then after that, it sort of became I knew from that workshop weekend that I wanted to do Jung for the rest of my life, and then it led from there to Pacifica. All roads kind of led to Pacifica and onward.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. A synchronicity in my life is that for many years, I worked in market research along with being a university professor, but I got into conducting something called focus groups as a way of tapping into consumer needs and so on. And the guy who brought me into that work is named Tony Wolff. I worked with him for 20 years or more,
Oh wow,
and only it was Tony Wolf.
yeah,
But the fact that the name Tony Wolff is so significant in the Jungian literature, and that's always struck me.
yeah, wow.
So maybe you've already said this, but when you discover Jung, was there a certain aspect that really spoke to you, that spoke to your soul?
Yeah, I think, right from the start with Tony Wolff's work, just the idea that there were these patterns, almost like a character type, like you might imagine from, a fantasy novel or Dungeons and Dragons or that sort of thing,
Mhm.
that there were these character types, these archetypes beneath our awareness that were really driving the bus. So why are some people really, really interested in, reading and learning in the world of ideas, and some people are really interested in achieving and sports and uh, you know being the best they can in the outer physical world, all these kind of characterological differences that they have an unconscious basis within us, but also a transpersonal basis. So you can see that a lot of people are in sort of personality tribes around
Yeah.
different archetypes,
Yeah.
and explains a lot about society and how people work and differences, and that different kinds of people are coming from different places. Just the idea that there were these patterns underneath.
Yeah. We're going to talk about that more as we go on.
Yeah, that was what I think hit me the most.
Yeah. Yeah. I can really relate to that. Um, of course, I started reading it in the introduction, and I thought that the introduction was really well done because it offers lots of examples of how Jungian ideas are present in today's culture. And one thing I learned there that I didn't know before was that Jung's books outsold Freud's, and that's been so all along.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow, to me that's kind of extraordinary. I didn't know that at all.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure I heard that from Sonu Samdashani, the editor of the Red Book. I could be wrong, but yeah, that's my understanding, is that the whole time that Jung has outsold Freud 2 to 1. Yeah.
Yeah, wow. Well, I'm willing to believe it. And you also cite in that section a Korean pop group who created a whole album based on Jungian concepts. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not into Korean pop groups
You're
particularly.
not.
Tell us
You're
a
not,
little bit
David.
about that.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So BTS, very popular worldwide. I mean, selling out stadiums in North America
I
size.
think I may have heard of them. BTS, does that stand for anything in English?
I'm not sure actually,
Okay.
but so yeah, I mean they found Murray Stein's Map of the Soul book, I believe, and there's a whole bunch of books that Stein is now putting out with BTS even in the title, and
Wow.
sort of really making hay with that. So they really found this stuff interesting, and there's a song called Persona that they did a video with people reacting to it psychologically. Um, to me, it just speaks to the fact that Jung's insight came from looking in the psyche rather than making up theories about it. And I know in a way that what we're doing with Jungian psychology is theoretical, but to me, the theories are coming from observation of the natural architecture of the psyche. So when you see, there was a conference on depth psychology in China that had like 3,000 people last year or the year
Wow.
before. So when you see interest in Jung, cropping up in all these different parts of the world. I mean, Jung is huge in South America. People don't know this. So all these other places, Jung's coming up, and I think the reason is because he was really looking inside as opposed to kind of making up his own ideas about what
In
was.
other words, he was tapping into universal things that people can relate to regardless of the culture that they're.
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, maybe we can touch on some of the high points, jumping around a little bit
Sure.
in your book.
Sure.
And for example, you have a chapter on inner work and suggesting that, in a nutshell, if I may use that term, that's the key thing. So tell us about that. The inner work. What's inner work?
Yeah. Well, the inner work chapter, we talk about dream work. We talk about active imagination, and I'll
Yeah.
talk about what that is. And the whole idea of therapy and what's going on with that. And I think I talk about Jungian analysis in that chapter too, and what it means to be a Jungian analyst. It's really interesting. You mentioned the in a nutshell. So the full quote of in a nutshell from Hamlet is, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams.
Wow.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I actually wanted to have that be the epigraph for the book, but the publisher didn't go for it. He's got a lot of nutshell books, so maybe he's sick of hearing that quote. But I,
Yeah.
I thought it was really perfect for this book.
Well,
So
one of the points that you make that I thought was a good one is that being a Jungian, whether you're in Jungian analysis or you're just a fan, he speaks to you or something, that to progress, to grow, really involves engaging in some kind of a process of, quotes, inner work,
mhm.
and that there are different techniques, not only that Jung used, but that people following him have developed to facilitate that kind of inner work.
Yeah, and I think we can talk about those different qualities and what they are. One of the things that I think my favorite part of that chapter is the end where I talk about Tony Wolff. Um, so at the end of that chapter, there's an example that talks about if a client was working with Tony Wolff and they had a big kind of revelation in the last session, and that there was an outcome from that revelation that they were needed to do X, Y, or Z. They needed to do something to honor it. If a client hadn't done that thing in the intervening week, she would basically scoot them out of the office and say,
Yeah,
come back when you mean business.
yeah,
And so it's not just, I mean, one of the things people I think in a negative way about Jungian psychology is it's sort of navel gazing and just inner reflection for its own sake. But I think it really is about getting in touch with what our, you could say our soul or our unconscious wants us to do differently in our lives.
Hmm.
What does it want us to live out? What does it want us to let go of? What does it want us to, um, honor in a physical, tangible way? One of the amazing, inspirations, and I let myself, have this experience on purpose to write the book. Last April, I went down to Santa Barbara and got to see a lot of Jung's art in a display at UCSB.
Wow.
Pacific obviously was involved with that. And they had all of Jung's, the carvings he had done and the paintings he had done. And so many of those are specifically honoring inner figures.
Yeah. That's one of the incredible things about Jung was that he was so many things, you know. He was an artist, he was a sculptor, he was a furniture maker, he was a house builder, he was an archaeologist, he was an adventurer, traveler, and the list just goes on. He was a linguist. He studied ancient languages. A little,
Yeah.
it's amazing
And
to,
the art for me was a way of taking the spiritual or the ephemeral inner life and putting it into something concrete, which is the
yeah,
one thing that those inner figures and inner experiences cannot do. They
yeah,
cannot make themselves concrete. They can affect us as emotion or in different ways. Um, but to see how seriously, the Red Book is the ultimate expression of this, how seriously Jung honored the inner life night after night, painting these little cells in the Red Book, each one perfectly done, honoring an inner figure. That is, Jung is about taking the inner life seriously.
yeah, very much so.
And so the different examples in chapter 3 in inner work, whether it's doing dream work or active imagination, the process of letting ourselves go into that in a waking state into the unconscious, all of that is in service of of doing something in the world, of changing our life, of knitting together the spiritual and the worldly and the physical. So
Yeah,
I think that's a big part of it that's really important, is what, it's something we do. Jungian psychology is something we do. It's a viewpoint, it's a philosophy, it's all those things. But to make change and to grow, it's about doing.
yes, yes. The unconscious is a very important concept for both Freud and Jung, but
Mhm.
they conceive of it somewhat differently. And maybe you can talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on Freud really, but the basic answer is that more or less Freud was looking at um, really a personal sense of the unconscious and a view of the unconscious, that it was sort of the repository of the refuse of the day, that sort of the basement or the that kind of thing, a personal place where the things that were rejected or not directly dealt with from the day were stored. Jung's view is that the conscious mind is the peak of the iceberg out of the water of a giant unconscious, and it's this larger matrix out of which our consciousness emerges. So very different view, and much more of a view that emphasizes sort of primordial nature in Jung, and that this unconscious part is much bigger, and then we sort of develop consciousness. Whereas for Freud, it was, the personal awareness is dominant, and the unconscious is there, but it's not as sort of big.
Well,
Again,
I think for Freud, it's mostly icky down
right?
there, right?
Sure.
It's the very primitive sexual and aggressive drives that he kind of ascribed to that area,
Yeah.
whereas Jung has kind of a higher unconscious, if you will.
Yeah.
He
Absolutely.
doesn't deny the lower, all that stuff, but he goes further to say that the big picture includes both the positive and the negative.
Yeah, Jung sees the unconscious as having a purpose, which is individuation and wholeness and developing us into greater, fuller human beings as much as we can, but also that there are mechanisms within us that sort of keep us safe through that process of growth, that it doesn't allow too much to come out at the wrong time, and that the process of analysis is very often watching the dreams for the right moment to wait for the healing. And
Uh-huh.
I think a big difference too is that Freud was looking at sexuality as the primary repressed content, and that repressed sexuality responsible for not only neurosis but creativity and the religious instinct and art. And Jung, of course, saw spirituality as its own pole in the psyche, as its own, having its own drive towards connecting spiritually within us. So very different views.
Yeah.
And you can sort of feel a masculine kind of dominant hierarchical thing with Freud for me, and Jung more of a feminine, connecting to nature, putting humanity in its place within nature.
Yeah. And another intriguing thing that I think you've kind of hinted at with Jung is that there's a sense of growing into something that in a sense is predetermined, that we each have come into this life with some kind of kernel of destiny,
Absolutely.
which is to be discovered, worked out, tuned into.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really comes forward in the archetypal work that I do. Yeah, so both in a sense that we have a specific character, so that we're planted in a certain place with certain dominance, certain personality type, certain qualities that bring us identity and fulfillment, and certain way of being. And I think that and recognizing that people are different, that not everyone is gifted in all the same ways. And I think, I mean, one of the things that is difficult for the kind of consumerist mentality that is a part of our culture today is that you're not going to be everything. And there's a lot of teachers that want to promise you to be everything, or and I do a lot of work with archetypal systems, the archetypal nature work I teach. And I think some of the other archetype systems are sort of a choose your own adventure. Like you tell me which archetypes are connected to you. And I think that for Jung, character is a bit more implanted. You're planted in a specific place and you flower and bloom from that place. And it's going to have a specific look, and different people are going to be gifted in different areas, and different people's destiny is going to look different, and it's going to look their own. And we're each doing our own journey, and that there aren't, um, there isn't a single kind of process. And he says that directly. One shoe pinches one person and doesn't fit another. There's no um, specific general pathway for everyone. And I think that's really important. And I think there's a lot of systems that want to, uh, even within the sort of Jungian world or on the edges of it, that want to say, oh, everyone does growth this way. And it's just like,
Uh-huh.
that's not a Jungian point of view.
Yeah. And I understand that his actual psychotherapies that he did with people was very much particularized for each person that he
Yeah.
saw.
Yeah.
And it would be hard to characterize his actual therapy from what we know as following some kind of being run by some tight theoretical point of view.
Yeah. And
I
I
mean, he
think,
would do things that were very totally unexpected, right?
yeah,
Out of left field, so to speak.
yeah. And he really did not see psychology as a technique, as a series of sort of objective steps, that X, Y plus this, then you get that. I mean, he really, really did not see psychology as that. He saw it as an art and something connected to mystic worldview and to spirituality and to something that was a sacred inner journey that had an art to it. It had a way that we work with nature in which something magical happens, and not something that can be objectively, turned into a factory of, everyone does X, Y, and Z, and then all of a sudden you're fully matured. Very different approaches. And again, the
Yeah.
difference between a masculine and, I would say, a more feminine approach.
I think often the founder of a great school of spirituality or such has followers that then encrust dogma. You've got the person who's had the original experience,
Mm-hmm.
and then there are the followers who are very impressed by that experience, and they need to understand it. And so it becomes encrusted with all of this dogma. And Jung is quoted somewhere as saying, "Thank God I'm not a Jungian." And I think that was in response to the organizations and the hierarchical stuff that began to happen, as happens in most any organization.
Yeah, and I think that that is what happens, and he certainly was. Jung rightly warned of the danger of collectivity, whether it's the collective psyche in the culture or collectivizing his own work. And I think there are many good things to be said for the Jung Institutes. I think the process of becoming a Jungian analyst, where people not only are educated and learn different schools of psychotherapy and the plumbing of the psyche in a really rigorous way over a 3, 4, 5, 10 year period, but also that they do their own work with an analyst and that becomes part of the evaluative process. I think that's really valuable and really important. And I think for me, I run Jungian Online, which connects people with analysts to work via video. We have a team there that's great, and you can really feel when you're working with or talking to someone that is doing that level of awareness all the time, that they really have achieved something powerful. But I agree that there are attempts to systematize Jung in ways that are not fruitful, not helpful, and that in my experience, when people systematize Jung in ways that he wouldn't have liked, they usually are reflecting their own psychological preferences.
Hmm.
They're usually saying, okay, growth works like X, Y, Z because it did for them.
Yeah. A couple of things I want to respond to here.
Yeah.
One was you talked about his warning about the dangers of getting too involved in the collective, in the
Mhm.
group, in the mass consciousness,
Yeah.
and so juxtaposed to that is the growth process that he calls individuation,
Yeah.
which sounds like, okay, there's the collective and there's the individual.
Yeah.
So that there's a kind of yin yang
Yes.
relationship between those two. The other thing I wanted to ask you is, given your deep involvement over a period of years with Jungian material, uh, I note that you are not a Jungian analyst. Is that something you think you'll do in the future? Is it something you plan to do? Is something that you rejected? What's going on around that?
No, it's not for me. It's not personally my journey, I think, to go further down that path. I like, as you can tell from the book writing, I feel I've got something to offer as a communicator.
Mhm.
So I really see my mission as to popularize kind of on the widest level, on the base level, to really speak to bringing new people into the church or whatever
Yeah.
of the Jungian world, and to open those doors and to make things accessible. I'm really averse to the kind of white tower movement of keeping all the Jungian knowledge up locked away and people pay their weekly fee to get a little drop of it. I'm
A
very
very stiff fee usually to
yeah.
become a
Well, I mean,
Jungian analyst.
lots of people on the Jungian Online site are actually affordable, but I think my calling is as a teacher and a writer, and I teach archetype workshops and other kinds of workshops, and I really feel that's what I'm gifted to do. I think the
Uh-huh.
calling to be a therapist is a really specific one, and it's really best to have people that are just doing that. I feel, looking back on this book, I finished it a year ago, and just looking back on it lately and hearing things like your feedback, it makes me appreciate that's probably what I'm here to do.
Yeah, I can really identify with that because it's something I've been thinking about just recently. I just wrote something about it, about my approach to my podcast, Shrink Wrap Radio, which is very broad, right? It's not, I've interviewed a bunch of Jungians and Jungian analysts, and I'm fascinated and infatuated with various aspects of it. But I also, cover a very wide waterfront of psychology generally, including research oriented stuff, cognitive behavior therapy, all the different schools of psychotherapy, and so on. And there are times when I've sort of had this critical inner voice that, oh, I'm being a dilettante, I'm not going deep enough. But a couple of times it's been pointed out to me that, no, wait a second, that's an important function that you're serving. And so, so I can relate to what you're saying, to discover, well, what's your gift, and doing what I'm doing that definitely is using who I am, all of my experiences and so on.
Yeah, and being a sort of liminal space holder,
Yeah.
inviting people in and sharing your enthusiasm for different things such that people want to look into them more. And I think that's a really valuable role.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I'm coming to, every now and then I have to re-own it.
Yes, for sure. And we all have that, critical father or whatever the energy may be that's, giving us negative feedback.
Yeah. So uh, one of the interesting things about Jungian psychology is there are all these s- strange terms that have been invented, you
Hmm.
know. And for example, uh, uh, and I guess the concept of the archetype really predates Jung,
Hmm.
historically, philosophically, etc. So we don't have to fully go in that direction. But for one example that would strike many people as strange is the shadow. I when I was a young kid, there was a program on the radio called The Shadow.
Yeah, the shadow knows.
Right, the shadow knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men.
There we go.
Yeah. So talk to us about the shadow. And I know that in your workshops, I think you do what's called shadow work, right?
I don't do that in my workshops
Okay.
specifically, but there is a teacher where I'm also developing a site called Jung Academy, where there's going to be folks from the Jungian Online team teaching. And one of the courses in development there is how do we do shadow work?
Hmm.
So the idea of Jung Academy will be applying these things. How do we do them? Again, it's bringing it down, not going up into theory. It's going
Right.
down into how we do
Right.
them, which I love. So again, I looked at the shadow section in the book yesterday, and the examples we include there are Gollum from The Lord of the Rings, and
Love
um,
that character.
yeah,
And the way it's portrayed in the movie in particular.
yeah, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And both those examples, you see the protagonist um, having certainly a lot of good qualities, and then the villain, Gollum or Mr. Hyde, um, expressing negative qualities that are not in the protagonist. So they're kind of mirrors for each other. So Frodo and Bilbo in Lord of the Rings are mirrored by Gollum. Gollum is consumed by his desire for power in the ring, and Bilbo is very gifted at not falling prey to that desire. So there's a mirror between those two. And in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, of course, you have the good Dr. Jekyll, who's very, adapted to societal values and upstanding and does the right thing. And then he drinks this magical potion, and out comes the shadow, which goes for what it wants and takes and is instinctual and dangerous.
Yeah.
All of these things, and it's so illustrative of the way we have a persona, or we have a way we present to the world full of our good qualities, and we've tap down or hid away our bad qualities, and that's so real. And I love the way that the shadow is portrayed in both those stories, because you see the necessity of that shadow character, that there's a truth there, that in the Lord of the Rings tale, Gollum is there right till the end, and at the end he is the one that goes into the lava with the ring and dies, but there's a purpose to him the whole time, and there's a purpose to the shadow, and we need that. It's expressing, we can't just be this good version of ourselves that we imagine ourselves to be.
Right.
Sometimes we talk about that as the persona. We can't just be that. We have to be the other part. One of the analysts on Jungian Online has a great quote that I put in the book about the shadow and the process of working with it. And it sort of summarizes all this up. She says, "I felt at first that acceptance of the shadow meant agreeing with those parts of myself. Gradually, I came to realize that it was not the case, Accepting and recognizing meant making those aspects of myself conscious. It did not mean necessarily liking them or condoning them, but accepting that they were there.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
from Elizabeth Pomez. And so, this part of us is alive. It's, one of the things that Jungian psychology helps us do is that we see that there's our waking state of self-awareness, but that there's almost other parts of us that are around. And you'll hear, you see people say, "Oh, I don't know what came over me," something like that. Well, that's one
Yeah.
of the parts acting out. And so the shadow is this part that holds values that are rejected by the daytime awareness. So if we're very nice, we might have a shadow that's more aggressive, more assertive, more taking and going for what it wants.
Yeah.
And that there's a healthiness to the desire to integrate that becoming a better, healthier version of who we are means making some room for that, for not just being this nice person all
Yeah.
the time, but
Yeah.
we've got to find some room to let the shadow have its day too.
Yeah, I try to be nice in my life, in my interviewing, etc. But I love to read crime novels. I actually co-wrote a book about a serial killer. Uh, so sometimes I have to look at that and say, well, or I have sometimes have dreams that have violence in them, and so so I think that kind of illustrates what
Yeah,
you're
it
talking
does.
about.
Yes, perfectly. Yes.
Yeah. And I accept it. I don't feel like I have to be super defensive about the recreational violence that I'm attracted to,
Sure. Yeah.
as long as I'm not acting it out.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that we, reject in Jungian psychology is perfectionism.
Uh-huh.
Marion Woodman writes about that so well, that our society really pushes us to try and be perfect, to try and live out an idealized version of who we are. She's particularly writing for women, but it's true for everyone, that our society really encourages that, and we've got to break through that and
Yeah.
make room for something that is a little less perfect.
Yeah. If we become over identified with that persona, uh, nice person self, uh, it can bite us in the butt
Absolutely.
unexpectedly. And I
Yeah.
often think of the Nazis during Hitler's era in Germany, and I don't think anybody set out to say, let's be the evilest folks that ever marched on the earth. I
Hmm.
think they, in many cases, held very high ideals and felt that they could create a Garden of Eden kind of situation,
Yeah.
and
And
there and that blinded them to much of what they were doing.
yeah, and I mean, Marie Louise von Franz talks about that in with the Nazi movement, that people fell into that movement through their personal shadow. They fell under the spell of a collective evil through their personal shadow. So if they were into money, it became about defending their fortune or getting more. If they were into power or whatever, the people's personal shadows opened them up to falling into that. And I think, right now we're kind of in um, the same situation. One of the quotes from von Franz in the book, she says that one of the greatest, individuation, she says, makes us capable of choosing our own path. Self-reliantly, we can remain true to our inner law. This is especially in times of collective neurosis. The existence of such mature people is of crucial importance.
Yeah,
So when there's all this collective insanity going on, having wrestled with our own shadow and some ability to identify and understand our own negative impulse and see that it's there is very powerful. And I think politically people, I have a line that I like to use, which is politically people really crave comforting oversimplifications.
yeah, sure.
And so I think and certainly Jung talked so much about the danger of the collective, that it can bring us down to the lowest common denominator.
Mm.
That what works in a group is appeal to the basest.
Well,
And
we see that in mob situations, right? Mob violence and so on,
yeah,
where people do things that they would never do, if it were
yeah,
just them.
yeah, that's right.
It kind of the it kind of releases something that's very primitive in us, and one of the ways that I've experienced that is being at say a football game when the crowd roars or some other sporting event. I feel tears welling up. There's a big emotional reaction that I get spontaneously, and I don't think I'm alone in that. Maybe I am, I don't know. uh, but that tells me that there is this vulnerability to this collective upwelling of energy.
Yeah,
And I can just feel that tugging in my insides.
sure.
And since we're talking about politics, you have the good fortune to be up north in Canada, where it seems relatively safe from down here looking up. Um, Relatively sane, I mean, and many of us down here are looking at Trump and
Yeah.
dealing with the reality of Trump. And so we get into this whole thing about collective archetypes, the collective, uh, the excuse me, uh, the projection of the shadow. There's the collective shadow and the personal shadow.
Mhm.
And I think on the liberal side, I sometimes wonder, well, how much, you know, what do we need to own when we demonize Trump? Or is he just, in fact, a real demon?
Well, I mean, that's one of my biggest interests, is the archetypal politics. So, you know, Jung has a great quote, and he says that the tension of the tribe comes down to the tension between the strong man, who is violent, the alpha, and the shaman. And to me, that is a really good summation of our kind of political unconscious. So I think one of the hardest things for the folks on the left to understand uh, is that there's a tremendous desire in a lot of people to have a strong leader.
Yeah.
And it's about strength. It's not about ideas. It's not about competence. It's not about, it's not about anything to do with abstract thinking at all. It's
uh,
about strength.
yeah.
So I think that's very hard for folks on the left to understand. And I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm saying these are archetypal truths.
Right.
So I think those kind of things are really important. And you see in terms of the shadow of the left, which is something that drives me crazy, coming from a Jungian archetypal point of view and being on the left myself, um, is that they tend to miss the sort of competition aspect of politics. That it is a competition for votes more than it is a competition of ideas or a debate class. It's like I talk about it sometimes as like Lisa Simpson complex, that the left think the smartest person in the room should just be president. They shouldn't have
Mhm.
to work for those votes. And so there is something more complicated going on there. And I'm going to write books about that. Shortly here, I'm working on a new one now, and the one after that's going to be an archetypal politics book. But for me, outside of the sort of differentiations of the left and the right and all that, which we could do hours talking about, and I think is really fascinating and really helpful to understand what's going on politically through an archetypal lens. Overall, I think there's a quote for me that sort of sums up what's missing in the US right now, especially with what's going on with the pandemic. And so I posted this recently on social media. It says, this is from Jung. It says, Western man has no need of more superiority over nature, whether outside or inside. He has both in almost devilish perfection. What he lacks is conscious recognition of his inferiority to nature around him and within him. He must learn that he may not do exactly as he wills. If he does not learn this, his own nature will destroy him.
Good quote.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, good quote. I'll quote from your book then. And I think it's in relation to the archetype known as the self, which we can
Okay.
discuss a bit.
Yeah.
But you, in your book, you write, the self is Jung's answer to the following question: what in us makes us strive to be more aware, more conscious, more moral, more loving, more embodied, more whole? Religious beliefs most often put God at the center of that drive in us. And Jung saw an overlap between our images of the self and our images of God. As it expresses the unity of the whole psyche, the self is connected to our images of the divine. Nice writing there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I quote also, I think in around that same point, Anne Ulanov, famous Jungian author and analyst, she says the self is the way we know God.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that Jung sees, that there's something in nature in us that is driven to look for God and driven to, I mean, it's an incredibly powerful part of who we are. Um, I almost don't know what to say about it. I mean, that produces these beautiful images, whether they're, of Jesus or a mandala or, um, feminine deity. I think right now there's some Kali, up in the
Yeah,
country.
right.
Um, but yeah, that there is the part of us, the self, that for Jung, that there's something that holds the whole process between the personal unconscious and the collective, between our personal unconscious and the shadow, that this bigger drive of the self is holding the container for the integration, at least a little bit, of these things, making it possible for us to appreciate, um, you know, objects of contemplation and reflection like a mandala, or that there's, I mean, certainly I felt when the pandemic was just coming out over the last couple of months, that there was the drive to look at a mandala to reorient and to find the place
Mhm.
of structure and order again in the midst of the fear and the chaos that people have been put into.
Yeah, yeah. What words would you have for listeners who are perhaps, since talking about the pandemic, how do you comfort yourself? What keeps your faith keeps you going? And I don't know that the pandemic is hitting hard there right now. The interview before this was with a psychoanalyst in London who says he personally knows 20 people who've died,
Whoa!
and
Wow!
that he hears the sirens, ambulance sirens, going all day long, where he used to not hear that. So there's a whole spectrum of how much grief, how much
Sure.
pain, how much sadness, how much loss, from high to low, with
Yeah.
all this out there. What how do you process this? Where do you put yourself in all this?
Sure. Well, I mean, I did a good presentation on this with one of the analysts on Jungian Online, David Presso, and a scholar that many of your listeners will have heard of, Becca Tarnas, who's Rick Tarnas's daughter. And the three of us had a talk, and people can get that through Jung Academy, Archademy, where we did an hour talking about how we respond to the pandemic. For me, partly what makes it okay for me is that, or that I deal with it, is to understand that there are bigger processes happening, that there's a way that what's happening is part of the cycle of change that we're in. Jung talked about that our era is a time of kairos, of the changing of the gods, that we're at an axial point where the whole um, dominating gods, the psychological structures that we count on, are changing. One of the biggest metaphors for that is the the drop off of the masculine impetus and the beginning of a more feminine one. And to me, that means moving from an attitude of superiority over nature to having to adopt an attitude of working with nature. And so, we're in the shifting of the tides where one impetus is ending and another is coming. And I think this masculine impetus in the States to kind of like, we're going to have our freedom no matter what. I mean, to me, that's like driving a car headlong right into Kali. I mean, it's just begging to have nature, chop you down. And
Mhm.
so I think that, America is kind of the tip of the spear in lots of ways of this most masculine drive that we're going to get what we want, ego, ego, ego. And that is just running right into a propeller right now. Uh,
Yeah.
and so, whether we look through an astrological lens, as we do in that talk with Becca and David, or we look at dreams, even David talked about dreams that his clients were having that really showed the importance of the feminine principle coming up now and a change of attitude, because ultimately that's what Jungian psychology is about. It's about dealing with the uncertainty of life, and it's about our attitude towards life, towards the world. And so if we can see a purposive lens, if we can see that what's happening right now is part of a bigger unfolding, that we'll have chapters after it, and that there's something happening that's important, even if it's painful. Um,
Yeah, it's not, it can be very painful to be in, we could talk about change abstractly, but if you're in the grinding place where the
yeah.
tectonic plates are moving, that
Hmm.
can be painful. But at the same time, I think there is maybe, if one can develop that sort of philosophical distance to see a larger picture and to realize this is not the end of everything. This is just part of the process
Hmm. Yeah.
of what's going on in the wider universe, and that we are not the whole universe.
Yeah, and that there is, I mean, Jung was a mystic, and this is one of the things that I'm very open about in the book. He believed in things like the extension of consciousness and precognitive dreams, and that our consciousness is more than just something happening between our ears. That there are mysteries in the way consciousness and the psyche travel around corners in time and space, and that like the mystic, we can look to the Tao, we can look inside, we can try and be in the right attitude and in the right place, and we can follow our own path, and that's available to each of us, and we can each look inside to find a truth and to find what our dreams are telling us and to pursue a course that is right for us. I also think that, as we continue to go into this time of change where there's going to be more crises, and this isn't the only thing. I think we're in a time where there's going to be more of these things. I think dreams are one of the ways that we can be led to safety, be led to make it through some changes, whether it's our own dreams or others. I mean, this is, when I think of the Bible or all these other, historic accounts we have of dreams saying, go, go this way, go that way. I mean, it's certainly indigenous people use dreams to know, well, we should leave here and go there. Uh,
Yeah,
so I think we can learn to follow the inner compass, particularly in times when the outer world is so chaotic.
yeah, yeah. That really rings for me. And I'm remembering one of my colleagues asking me, David, what's all this Jung stuff about? Why do you keep interviewing people about Jung? He's on a more traditional psychotherapy track. And as I thought about that, I said, well, it's the mystery, that the Jungian thing speaks to the mystery. And I think that there's mystery in all of this. We don't have all the answers. We don't know everything that's going on.
Yes.
And the Jungian world keeps a place for that open.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I see as part of the masculine impetus in our culture that is fading, it's been useful, but it's fading, is that it constantly demands that we're certain.
Right.
You have to have all the answers. Oh, you don't have the answers, you're bad.
I've
You know,
never felt that I had all the answers.
I think in our culture that
Problems.
we're expected to know, we're
Yeah,
expected, there's this, and certainly the certainty that we have about everything is crumbled for most people a little bit right now.
yeah.
So
We live in a time of experts, right? The media are hungry for experts. And so just about anybody who's got a blog or anything, may be called upon to put on the hat of an expert
yeah.
and act as if they know.
Yes, that's why I mean, it's very alluring to peddle in comforting oversimplifications.
Yeah,
And that's what people want, is they want to be told, okay, here's the answer.
yeah,
And Jung does ask us to sit with the mystery.
yeah, yeah. Let's talk a bit, before we could, there's a lot more material here in your book that we could go into, but I want to spend a little time. You've mentioned Jungian Online
Yeah,
is a service that you've founded
yeah,
to help people connect with a Jungian therapist.
yes.
Very timely now that everybody's going into online virtual therapy.
Yeah.
Um, I frankly didn't know that something existed until you brought my attention to the fact that this was something that I guess you've been doing for a while.
Yeah, I founded it in 2011. So next year will be 10 years.
And so tell us about it. Tell us how
Yeah.
it works.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So Jungian Online, I founded it in 2011, and where we're at today is that we have, I think, about a dozen analysts and therapists, a couple more than that, mostly Jungian analysts now, and a lot of authors and people that have written books and that sort of thing, where a client who wants to work with an analyst via video can fill out a form, come on and say a little bit about what they want to work on. And then I get that form and try and match them, or I'll have a video meeting with them and talk about who we think might be a good match for them. And then they work with that analyst, and all the billing and all that's between them. I just try and do a good job matching, or I'll meet with them. Everybody on the site is, certified, registered analyst, highly qualified, or a therapist. Yeah, we have gone from being kind of like an outsider group to an institution in a matter of months. And so although we were getting a lot bigger the last few years, it's been getting bigger and bigger. And we have a lot of people. I mean, we have a couple a day basically at this point, new clients coming in, and the referral's free, and my meeting with the clients is free. And then when they get to work with the analyst, they do all the money between them, and it frees people up. I think, obviously before this all came down, there were good reasons. It's good for the environment, no gas. I mean, even people in LA don't want to sit in traffic for an hour or 2 hours to get to a therapy appointment for an hour.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think for a lot of people, working online is actually more comfortable. There certainly are drawbacks, and you're missing the body a bit, and those kind of things. But there are some people that actually thrive with it. And we have clients that are traveling the world and want to be able to get to their therapist anytime they want. So there's a lot of really good healing work going on this way, and now everybody's online, so it's accepted. But
So are any of your people doing sort of full on Jungian analysis, such as would qualify the client to then apply to a Jungian institute and say, I've had 2 years of therapy with so and so?
yeah, they have. I mean, some of the different institutes do it differently. So some of them have rules about a certain percentage of it. Like some of them are, oh, if you've done a video analysis, 50% of the hours count, or whatever. But that's all changing. Yeah, no, it is analysis. People do full on real Jungian analysis via video. So it's
But I gather that some do less than that, right? Some people are not maybe seeking
yeah,
from browsing your site. I've sort of
yeah,
formed some opinions
yeah,
that uh, somebody might feel like, boy, there's a symbol that keeps cropping up for me. I'd really like to talk to somebody about it who's got some experience. I don't know how long it'll go on or where it'll lead to,
Sure.
but I kind of have that focus.
Yeah, and there's different kind of experts that work on different fields or different parts of this too. Absolutely, there are some people that just come on for short term. Some people that want to do real Jungian analysis and meet every week. Some people want to do every second week. Some people just want to explore and get started. So that's all fine. You don't have to have. I mean, certainly some of our analysts prefer to really be doing analysis, but there is a whole range, and clients can come in from any place and want to do any kind of work or just explore.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. Because the analysts are setting their own rates. I don't know if it's possible for you to talk about a range that people might expect to pay.
Yeah, I mean, for some it can be, as low as 100 US an hour. That's kind of standard for a bunch of our analysts. Some it's as high as 150 US an hour. So that's the fee range that we tell folks to expect, and they can indicate on their form, I'm in this 90 to 110 range, or in the 120 to 150 range, and that's about where it's at. There's not much lower than that. It's available.
Okay. I sense in you something of a businessman. Do you have any, where did that part come from? Do you have training or background or
Yeah,
orientation?
oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I come from a business family. So my mother and grandmother had a business where I grew up, and I was working in a business when I was 11, and actually was had a real job selling computers when I was 14, and so I've been doing sales and marketing and training since I was 15, 16 years old.
No
So
wonder. Okay, good. uh, do you want to say something about how people can find you and if they want to learn more about these initiatives that you're into?
yeah, sure. Just to get everything for me, they can go to gsbobroff.com, gsbobroff.com. That's my main site where there's links to all this. So the Jungian Online is probably the biggest thing I'm doing right now, and it's jungianonline.com. We just launched the Jung Academy, and that's for video courses and live events teaching this stuff. And that came out of people on Jungian Online saying, Gary, we'd really like to be teaching.
Uh,
And so I eventually, it took me a while to listen, but I eventually heard them and started this next site, and we're putting events and developing courses on there for that. And that's Jung Academy, ARCHADEMY.com. And then I also do archetypal nature, which is Tony Wolf's archetype system, understanding ourselves and other people today. And I'm writing a book on that right now. And that's probably going to be rebranded under another name, but for now it's archetypal nature.
well, I have a feeling we will probably be talking more in the future if you keep turning out these books.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you so much for your enthusiasm for the book. And it feels good. And I appreciate, you see and have seen a lot of uh, psychological material. So I appreciate your praise. Thank you.
Well, Gary S. Bobroff, thanks for being my guest again today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Pleasure, David.